opening. So, welcome to the session, and this is basically the first session in the series of four-part that we have, right? And it's divided into the four sessions, and these sessions would be run differently than you might have seen any other Azure fundamental training over the YouTube. For the reason, because I'm going to focus mostly on the whiteboard. So I have understanding of the content, what it takes to cover from AZ-900 or Azure fundamental perspective. I will reference to that content, but I will try to basically rewrite that here in the whiteboard, and that's how the session would be run. So this is the first session. In case there are any difficulties, any problems that you are facing, or any technical issues, just be patient with me. I think in the next session, right, we'll have them all sorted. So with that, welcome to the class. And as you see my screen, the first session and the content that we're going to cover in this session would be, I hope you can see my screen. There are 6 items that we are going to talk about in this. And since we're talking about cloud computing, right, more into the Azure context, I think before we even delve into cloud computing, we will start with a case study where we would try and understand, how, let's say, a typical business or a small business basically starts its journey. At what point in time do they basically feel a need, right, to get rid of the manual stuff that they have been doing to operate their business, and they decide to adopt technology. They decide to adopt software or, let's say, hardware, right, to drive their business growth. And then from there, at what point does that business feel a need really to adopt technology such as cloud computing, right? So before we appreciate what cloud computing can do, we will first try and understand what are the challenges that a hypothetical business entity that we are going to talk about faces as they delve into their business and they witness, let's say, significant growth. How does the cloud addresses all those challenges that emerge out of that, right? So that's basically the first thing that we're going to talk about here. Okay. Second would be, once we have understood the problem, right, then we will relate it to what cloud computing is and what benefits does it bring, and how those benefits are addressing some of the challenges that we have understood from case study 1. Okay, so we will talk about that right here. So why cloud computing, right? What would happen if there was no cloud computing for the same business that you're going to talk about? Okay, so we will talk about all of that. Now, as in any area, it is good to get familiar with, with the terms and terminologies, right? So there are some key terms and terminologies that you need to get used to when we talk about cloud fundamental or basically computing in cloud in general, right? So we will cover those key terms here in point number 3, right? And then we will talk about, although you might have heard about public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid cloud, but just bear with me, right? Stay here to hear my perspective on that and what does it mean, because there are many people, who actually get confused about, hey, how do we differentiate between, let's say, private and hybrid cloud, right? How is private cloud different from my own data center, for example, right? So we will talk about all that. So we'd like to draw absolute clarity there, right? And what are the benefits, advantages, and disadvantages of each, right? Or basically the strength and the weaknesses of each is what we are going to talk about here in item number 4. And then we want to double click on something that is very important to understand, because in cloud there are 3 ways in which services are offered, and those services are basically categorized into 3 areas. A service in cloud could be IaaS, right, which is infrastructure as a service, or it could be platform as a service, or software as a service. So we'll take a practical example. We will start from very basic, and then we will basically peel it one by one as to you understand clearly what these 3 things mean. Okay. And we're going to start with a very simple and very basic type of example so that you can relate, right? You can understand, it can retain. Okay. And then in number 6, we're going to talk about core Azure architectural component. Now, as we talk about the benefits of cloud, as we talk about the benefits of cloud here, some of the benefits as they come up, right? They are basically coming up from the architectural components of Azure, how Azure is architected, right? So that is basically giving those strengths, those advantages to the cloud, right? So it is important for us to understand those architectural components which are powering or which are providing those benefits. Okay. So with that, let's get started with the case study first. And we're going to talk about, an entity which is called Bella's Boutique. So who is Bella? Bella is basically somebody, right, who has been basically very, very creative since her childhood, right? So she's Bella. She's been very, very creative since childhood, and she learned, how to make basically handmade jewelry from her mother. And as she grew up, right, she was always into opening her own business. And as she graduated from the college, she actually decided to open up her own business in the town where she was living, right? So she was basically living in one of the town in India, right, in the state of let's say Karnataka, right? So it's basically a state in the southern part of India. In a small town, she started that business, and the way she started that business was that she basically got a small shop to begin with, and she started basically creating those handcrafted jewelries and with all the display and those sort of things available in her shop, and people would just walk over the counter. They will choose whatever they like, they would pay, and what Bella would do is that she would give them, collect the money, right, keep it there, record it, maintain the ledger, do the invoicing manually, right? Everything was manual. And then what happened is, as more and more as more and more customers, right, started coming in, as her shop got really, really popular, she actually hired a couple of more people as well just to help her out, and these would become her staff. And now they were actually creating more and more handmade jewelries, and all the entire staff was basically helping her to run this shop right here, right? The number of staff actually grew, and what happened is that as a result of that, the amount of manual or laborious work that she had to do actually increased significantly, right? She saw that customers were basically liking the product. They were coming and they were purchasing from within the town, at least, right? If not from so far away. But behind the scenes, she was having to do a lot of laborious work, like maintaining the invoices, maintaining the cash, right? Keeping track of the inventory, etc. And it was all paperwork. And pretty soon she realized that there has to be a better way, right? So then what she did is, uh, she basically, yeah. So what she did is that, give me yeah. So what she did is that, she actually got in touch with one of her friend who used to work in IT services company. And what they decided to do was that, how this friend of her could actually help her digitize the estate, right? So whatever she was doing right now, how can all this be converted and take her business to the next level where she doesn't really have to worry about any of these manual tasks as she was maintaining, right? So with the help of the technology, how she could push her business right from phase one into phase two, where she can actually then accelerate further sales, right, and further customer growth as well. Now, what this friend of her helped her do is to basically set up her own small IT estate, right? So what she did is that, beside beside her shop, she basically rented another shop there, and she actually converted this thing into what was called as basically a server room, right? She got all the racks and all the storages purchased, right? All the networking equipments, etc. She actually deployed in that room with the help of that friend. And they basically help her do two things. They basically help her develop, with the help of this software and hardware, they help her develop a website on which she could then take pictures of this product and she could then upload, right? And then she wanted to open up so that there is a website, everybody can purchase that, and then she would work with the delivery providers, right, who would then ship that product to the customer. So that actually was going to bring a lot of boost to her customer. So there was a website to maintain, but on the other side, in terms of the data as well, if you see, there was a lot of data, such as invoices were to be maintained, inventory was to be maintained, right? All the transactions that were happening online, online or even in store, right? Because she was basically adopting technology more. All that actually created a lot of data, as you can imagine. It actually created a lot of data. In terms of the data, data was basically, number-based data. There was text data, and as well as there were images, as you can imagine, of the product. Everything had to be stored. So in this particular shop, what she did is that she basically got some some compute capacity, right? Some compute capacity. Compute capacity means there were server racks, right? Bare metal devices, which were kept over there. So these were basically the servers and the racks. And then beside that, there was basically storage layer. So there was a lot of storage that was provided to her. And then what happened is that the storage would get used to store all this data, images, text, and numbers. All that would go to the storage. On top of it, then there were racks on which there were servers deployed, and those servers would then host the website that we had, right? So this website would be hosted on the servers, and as long as servers are up, the website is up, right? The website is accessible to the customer. Now, she actually provisioned the power backup as well, because she realized pretty soon that my business is based out of a small town. And what happens if someday there is a blackout, right? There is power disruption. She actually provisioned the power supply as well. So basically, things like things like inverter or the power backup were provisioned as well. Okay, so everything was going fine, and her business actually moved from phase one to the phase two. And then what happened one fine day was that there was basically a complete blackout, in the entire area. And unfortunately, her power backup that she was leveraging upon, that was completely consumed, and thereby there was no power supply available, and therefore her website went down. And due to that, on a daily basis, she actually saw tens of thousands of sales loss because website was down. The orders could not be placed. Although over the counter sale was still continuing, but online sale stopped completely, right? So the first challenge that she realized was here, that in case something goes wrong with this particular setup, my business would be put to standstill, right? Okay. Things were things were restored, right? So what happened is that the power was restored, and then what happened is, so this is scenario number one. Scenario number two, during festival, during festival, she would witness tremendous amount of increased transactions, right? Increased orders. And what she realized is that basically, 40 thousands of USDs that she had spent on provisioning this server and everything else that she spent, is not able to cater to the demand as it is coming in, right? So if you see, if we talk about, let's say, the festival in India, and if we talk about Deepavali, for example, then what happens is there is this period of, let's say, 1 week where there would be more and more sales happening. Thereafter, when this is gone, then we don't perhaps require that much of hardware or that much of compute power to be powering her website, right? So then she actually understood another challenge with this setup, and that challenge was that it is not elastic. This setup is not elastic at all. If I have to cater to the demand of the festivities, I might have to perhaps purchase, let's say, another 40,000 USD worth of hardware and just to keep it in my room, and I'm only using it for a week. It is not workable, right? So that elasticity challenges came up, right? Basically, disaster recovery type of challenges basically came up as well. Okay. And then, as you can imagine, with this setup, there are many other challenges also. If due to any reason the shop actually goes down or the server room goes down, then everything would be down. There is no high availability, right? Now it was getting increasingly expensive for her to basically provision a DR site in that case, and then have a mechanism to copy over the data from this particular room to the another room. And for that, she had to spend more and more money, right? So a lot of challenges. She decided that this will not scale, right? And then she basically got in touch with the same friend because she actually wanted to now get over all these limitations, all these challenges that she was facing. And that actually led to the phase three in terms of the growth of her business, where she actually got in touch with the same friend. And by that time, some time had passed and the cloud technology was becoming very, very popular. And they started having a conversation around the cloud technologies. And her friend basically explains to her that how implementing computing in cloud is different than doing it in on premises, right? Firstly, she basically, wonders as to what is this cloud computing thing? Can you explain to me in simple language? Tell me what this cloud computing is. And her friend responds saying that now having seen how a business is run in on premises in your shop, you needed essentially three things to power that business using technology. And those three things were: number one, compute. You needed compute. Compute would be, your CPU power, for example, right? So you need some compute, which was provided that you bought the physical hardware. In addition to that, compute would also require, basically memory, the RAM as we have in our laptops in general. In addition to that, she required a lot of storage because there was a lot of data that was being generated as well, right? Uh, so in terms of the storage, yeah, storage would be required as well. And there is second thing. Other than that, networking equipments, right? That would then let her on-premises shop connect to the internet, make the website that is hosted here available to everybody over the globe, or at least, at least in her town and beyond within India, or perhaps globally, if she's really ambitious. So all that was required at the first place. Okay. Now her friend tells her that imagine that all these services are actually provided to you by somebody. And rather than you owning or purchasing or acquiring all of that and finding a place to fit in somewhere in a physical location, we let a cloud provider to manage that for you, right? And you can use these services in on-demand basis is what cloud computing is all about. So cloud computing, he's telling her that is all about providing the compute resources, storage, networking, monitoring, backup, recovery, all that, all those capabilities to you on-demand basis, and you no more have to own all these infrastructural component, but you just go there and you rent it out, and you rent it out for as long as you want that. Whenever you don't want, just release it and you don't pay, right? And this actually sounded very attractive to her. Okay. And then her question was, hey, all right, we're talking about cloud. I think sounds like a good idea, but where do we go, right? Who do we get the services from? So, of course, in terms of the cloud provider, then, okay, I'm looking at the chat. Can you give more context on elasticity for scenario number two? No problem. So, see, so we will actually cover that here. But elasticity simply means that now, since we are talking about cloud, she is coming to the cloud. During the festivities, she's renting a certain amount of compute resources from the cloud provider. And during the festivity, she can actually request from the cloud provider that double my capacity. I'm bringing my website and I'm hosting it here on your infrastructure, right? Only for that 1 week, double the capacity. Once that 1 week has passed, lower it down. This she couldn't have done in on premises without acquiring perhaps double the capacity and paying everything upfront. Although the rest of the time, all this increased capacity would be of no use because it is only used during the festivity. So this is elasticity that clearly she could get in the she could get in the cloud. Right now, when it comes to the when it comes to adopting the cloud, then the next question was, all right, tell me key cloud providers. So of course we have Microsoft, right? Now her friend basically happens to be advocate of Microsoft technologies, and she basically decided to go ahead with Microsoft. Now her decision was made. She understood what cloud computing is, and thereafter she then wanted to go deeper into, now first tell me, how would the cloud computing address some of the challenges that I was facing in my on-premises environment? Okay. Now, we start with the challenges. In the meantime, if you have questions, type in the questions in the chat window. Questions would get answered. If not in the session, I'll make sure that I put it in the comment once this video goes out on YouTube. Okay. So I will make sure that that all the questions are answered. Just do me a favor that if your question is not answered, take that and put it in the comment window, and I'll go there and I'll answer that. Okay. Right. So we understood cloud computing with that. Now let's talk about some of the key concepts that actually come in, or some of the benefits of cloud computing. Okay. So we'll talk about benefits of cloud computing now. Benefits of cloud. And apologies, my handwriting is not so good, but I think as long as you can understand, it should be fine. Firstly, she was basically concerned about how high availability challenges would be dealt with. Yeah, basically high availability challenges. And she was told clearly that high availability is benefit of one benefit of cloud. Now she wants to understand as to how high availability is dealt with when she decides to bring this website over to the cloud. Okay. Now, rather than talking just the simple day-to-day language, in order to understand the benefits of the cloud, let's get to the specific technical concepts to understand how does cloud, something like Azure, provides you high availability. Okay, so we are now transitioning from the pure theoretical explanation to understand how high availability is delivered, and consider that this friend of Bella is answering that question of her, right? So that she can better understand high availability. How does Azure work? Azure is basically a global, cloud service provider from Microsoft, right? How it works is that, see, at the end of the day, at the bottom, for example, if I'm based out of Singapore and Azure is providing services in Singapore, they have their data centers here in Singapore. They have their physical data centers, right? But you don't really have to take care of that. So they are managing it, right? So at the bottom, we would still see data centers, but as long as you are not managing it, it's fine. Okay. So high availability basically means that she basically decided, to deploy her website at one location, right, in one of the data center in wherever she was staying in Karnataka on Azure. What Azure would do is that it would automatically, uh, you know, it would automatically replicate, right, this thing over here. And when it comes to the end user, the website would be, because website would have been deployed, right, over more than one instances in Azure data center. The user would be basically connected, would be connecting to a common point, which is basically kind of a load balancer, right? And behind the load balancer, Azure would automatically take care as to whichever server is up would complete the request, would send the request to order that handmade jewelry to the backend server. And this will be taken care of by Azure automatically. So high availability would be there because it would be replicating whatever you are putting in there, which is website in this case, to another server in another data center. Not just in another data center, but it could be that another data center in another region itself. It can do that, right? So that's how it would provide high availability. Then she actually, talks about, uh, hey, tell me about scalability. Scalability during festivities, I have basically a lot of demand, right? How would this address? If I were to move my websites from these physical servers to Azure, how would this address that? And her friend basically tells her that, hey, see, today you are provisioning a VM which is this big, let's say, in terms of CPU and memory, it is this big. But during that festivities, Azure will provide you scalability, by which you can basically, you can scale up. You can scale up this server just for the week in which you are expecting more orders to be coming in, only for that week. So it will scale that up for that 1 week. Once that week is gone, it will scale it down. And you are again paying for only what you're using. Only for that 1 week period, you are paying the additional cost, but thereafter it would automatically bring the size down for you because you're not expecting anymore, those many requests anymore, right? So you would pay only for what you are using. It will provide you scalability in that sense. So high availability and scalability, and of course we will go deeper, okay? But yeah, but see that now. Uh, Scalability, could be all right. I think let's park it here for now. The other thing would be basically disaster recovery, right? Because she was she was witnessing that there was a power cut and the uh, and the premise actually went down, right? And then the power had to be restored for her to bring her website up, correct? There could have been other scenario where, let's say, something goes wrong, right? There is, let's say, there is some physical damage, right, to the shop, right inside the shop, and that actually leads to, for example, damaging the data, right, or damage to the actual hardware as well. In that case, how do you restore that? So her friend actually tells her that what you can do is that, let's say if you are staying out of one state in India, let's say state one, Azure provides this automatic capability that your website and the associated data, all the data, your product data, invoicing, transactions, etc., it can actually make a copy of all of that, and it can put it in another location, right? Perhaps in another state. If this is, let's say Karnataka, you can actually send a copy of this to Delhi. So Karnataka being in the South Delhi, Delhi being in the North Delhi, you can actually do that. And it is highly unlikely that even if there were to be a natural disaster, right, one location might go down, but not both. And this is inbuilt. You get it for free. So you don't have to spend so much of money as you were anticipating earlier, right? So this becomes the third benefit of cloud computing, that it gives you disaster recovery built in. Okay, right. And now, uh, there are many other things. For example, yeah, and one thing I would like to touch upon is the global reach. Global reach. Now, if Bella is really ambitious, then what she would want to do is that once she has launched her business, she has migrated over to the cloud, her website is running in the cloud infrastructure, she would want the product to be sold out not just in India, but outside of India as well. And therefore, she realizes that adopting something like Azure would actually open up a lot of opportunities where she can make her website hosted across many different regions, right? Not just India, not just Asia, but America, Europe, Middle East, everywhere. And as long as she can take care of the logistical part, which is to ship the product, this would actually significantly boost her business as well, right? So that global reach, she's told that she's provided with, right? So, for example, let's say we are talking about India region right here. Yeah, so we are talking about India region. She can actually host the same website in US region, the same website in Europe region, and all that can be done very, very easily. Now she doesn't have to maintain those physical shops basically there, right? She can just, with the click of a button, she can replicate all this, and this website can be available across all these regions, and orders can be placed. Okay, so this global reach is available. Now, although she's based out of the small town, but cloud technology has actually opened up a lot more opportunities for her. Now, the other thing is agility. Agility. We talk about agile. Now, initially, when she set up her small on-premises data center and she bought everything, it actually took us, it actually took her about 2 to 3 months from the point she got in touch with her friend to then acquiring the hardware, installing the software on that, right? Developing the website, testing the website, deploying the website, and having it operational. It took almost 3 months because it included the time that she required to provision the hardware and install the software, etc. There was no agility. It wasn't fast enough. So now with cloud, if let's say tomorrow she would like to expand her business to not just sell handmade jewelry, perhaps also sell, handmade clothes, for example, she can very quickly spin up another website very quickly on the same infrastructure and make it global very easily. She doesn't have to worry about provisioning all that infrastructural component. So now she's able to bring her product, her ideas to the market really quickly. And that is what exactly the agility means. And that's what cloud provides you. I will pause here. If everything is going fine so far, just put it in the chat window that you are good. We are going good. Can you do that now? Okay. All right. Right. Now, these were, some of the benefits that actually came up, and Bella was convinced that, there is no reason we should not go to the cloud, right? Because what it is doing is that it is basically providing you high availability, scalability, disaster recovery, global reach, and then agility also. And then also she doesn't have to spend so much of money as well, right? Because only when she requires a little bit more compute or storage, she will take it, right? She will take it. And as soon as it is not required, she can release the resources. So that actually would help her save cost as well, correct? Because she's only paying for what she's using, right? So from the cost perspective, from the cost perspective, it actually becomes a lot more efficient. It becomes a lot more efficient, right? It becomes basically faster when it comes to agility, and when it comes to cost, it becomes a lot more efficient for her to run that business, right? So these are some of the benefits of the cloud, and she understood all of that, and with that, she basically got a little more curious as to, since you're talking about that it would cost you less, how would it cost me less? Can you explain that to me? So that's where this concept of economies of scale basically comes up. Economies of scale. So let's talk about this thing called as economy of scale. And you will basically hear that a lot. Economy of scale basically means, or it basically is the ability, right, where, okay, so it's the ability of the cloud provider where they invest so much of money in provisioning so much of compute power at scale, right? That maintaining some of the overheads, for example, in terms of the power supply, right? In terms of the maintenance, in terms of the operational cost, and in terms of the security aspect, it actually becomes a lot more cheaper for them because they're doing it at scale. They're doing it at scale. For an example, if Bella had to take care of high availability, disaster recovery, security, networking aspects, agility, all by herself, it would have become very, very costly for her. But since Azure is building that infrastructure from bottom up in such a way that they have regions, they have data centers all across, they are built in to support high availability and scalability and fault tolerance, etc. It actually becomes a lot more easier for these cloud providers to support all these capabilities by spending less money, right? Because they are basically doing it at scale, and they know the optimal way of doing that. That a business alone can't actually possibly do that, right? So this economies of scale, that you do it at scale, you can actually then do the same thing that would otherwise cost you so much more cheap, in a more cheaply manner, right? And as a result of that, since it is cheaper for Microsoft, for Azure, they can actually offer these services back to you at the cheaper cost. So that is what economy of scale is basically all about. Now, just to absolutely make it clear, cybersecurity, right, is a very popular area. There are security threats, cyber threats, everywhere around us. Imagine Bella having to take care of security by herself in her own premises. It is not possible because threats are emerging every single day, and there has to be defense that should develop much more aggressively than the threats. There is continuous investment which is required. Bella in her own data center would never be able to match that. So therefore, we let something like Azure take care of that. They do it at scale. they can keep up with the pace, but they provide you the same capability, same security at a much cheaper rate. So that is what economy of scale means, right? So I hope that actually made it clear. Right. So we will talk about, yeah, there are advantages there, and there are also some, some disadvantages that you might actually face when it comes to the cloud. And I think we will eventually get there, right? So not to worry about that. So that is economy of scale. I hope you understood that concept now. The other thing that I want to talk about, because we were talking about, some of the key terms and terminologies when it comes to cloud. There is this, term about, and I'm sure, many of you must have heard that, capital expenditure, right? Capital expenditure to operational expenditure. So, so what it means is that, in short, we sometimes say that we are moving basically from capex to opex. Yeah. So please understand this concept as well. What it means is that when Bella started the business, she had to provision everything, right? She had to look out for a place, rent out a place beside her shop. She had to purchase all this hardware, software, networking equipment, and get somebody to assemble that, right? And then she had to pay the cost upfront, right? Making an estimation as to I might expect 10,000 customers, right? 10,000 customers at any point in time. And keeping that in mind, keeping that scale in mind, she had provisioned the hardware, or she would provision the hardware. But she has to pay for everything upfront. 100% cost is paid upfront. Now, that would also make her to buy a little extra capacity just in case required, right? Because more is better, less is not better, correct? But she will have to pay everything upfront. And that becomes capital expenditure from a business perspective, that you have to pay everything upfront. The benefits that you're getting from it in return would actually come up eventually, but you have to spend everything upfront to provision all those hardware, software, and everything. That is capital expenditure, right? You might use it fully or you might not use it fully, but you must spend money to provision everything now. Okay, that is capital expenditure. As you move from on premises to cloud, it actually becomes operational expenditure model, which actually means that now, it is similar to how you pay your utility bill, your electricity bill. As much as you pay, or as much as you use, you pay, right? You use more, you pay more. You use less, you pay less, right? So just understand that as we move from on premises to cloud, as we adopt cloud, we are transitioning from capital expenditure to operational expenditure model. Okay, so that is what it means. You are not billed immediately, but you only pay for what you're using. And that's why you would actually hear this term, which is very commonly heard in cloud computing, right? Which goes like pay as you go. So you pay as you go. You don't have to pay anything upfront. The more you use, the more you pay. The less you use, the less you pay. Okay. So there is no upfront cost when it comes here, and you only pay for what you consume. So perhaps Bella in this case, during festivities when there is a lot more demand, for example, she would pay a little more to the cloud provider like Azure, because more and more customers are coming up, and more compute power is being provided to her, right? Let's say the size of the machine is actually increasing. uh, Azure is allocating more compute, more memory to the server, to the same server for that period of 1 week. So she's actually paying more within that 1 week. But once that is gone, then again, the size is restored back to the original, right? So she's only paying as she's using, as she goes. Okay, right. Now, just to very quickly, circle back, what we talked about, she basically came to the cloud and we talked about some of the benefits of the cloud: high availability, scalability, disaster recovery, global reach, agility, and cost effectiveness, or basically pay as you go model, right? We talked about economies of scale, which means that the more you do it at scale, the cheaper you can offer the services at. And then capital expenditure and operational expenditure. In on-prem, it is always CAPEX, and in cloud, it is OPEX. Okay. So then now we will talk about various types of clouds, right? Various types of clouds. And we were, mainly talking about three types where we had, private cloud, we had public cloud, and then we had hybrid cloud. What does it mean? So you understand it in this manner that Bella was running her infrastructure in her shop, right? She was responsible for everything if you look at it, right? It was the entire setup was owned by Bella. In case anything goes wrong, let's say the rack actually is broken up, some hardware is spoiled, there is power which is to be provided, it is all the responsibility of Bella. She has to take care of that, right? Because she is in full ownership of that of the data center, I would say. Okay, and that is equivalent of private cloud. Now, Bella's is running a business, so it is actually an entity, right? It is a business, and that business is hosting all the solutions, all the applications that it requires to run its business in their own data center is actually called private cloud. Okay, you have to manage everything. Though you manage everything, but you get full control over that. So please understand that, right? You have absolute responsibility to manage everything, but you also have full control, right? So in a way, it actually increases overhead, your responsibility, correct? Uh, but on the other hand, it actually gives you absolute control as to you can do whatever you want with that. Okay. So we will actually take a look at what does that control mean and how, increasing that control or reducing that control would make an impact. We will get to that. But this private cloud is basically when Bella was running it in her shop. This is private cloud. Okay. Private and then public cloud. Public cloud is when she actually decided to go over from on premises to Azure. Okay. On premises to Azure. She came on Azure. Azure is basically a public cloud provider, right? It's a public cloud provider. Now, when it comes to public cloud providers, there are benefits. For example, now she doesn't have to maintain, that infrastructure. It is all maintained by Microsoft, right? And she was in the sole ownership of this entire data center, right? She was in full control, absolute control. It is not that there is another shop beside her and that shop is actually also sharing the same infrastructure to run their website. No, it was in complete ownership, right? Public cloud is slightly different in that aspect. And we call this thing as single tenanted, right? Tenant, basically renting. Who is renting? If there is only one entity renting in the private cloud, it is Bella's boutique. It is single tenanted. Public clouds are multi-tenanted because within the same region, within the same data center, you might have Bella's boutique, you might have Simon's boutique, right? You might have Ajay's boutique. They all are requesting for the compute, requesting for the space in this entire Azure, and then they are all basically running their businesses over there. So for that reason, this is actually called as multi-tenanted. So public cloud is multi-tenanted. You don't have absolute control. You can't say that, hey, show me how are you running your servers, show me how are you connecting them together. You don't have to worry about that. It is not your responsibility. So you have less headache, right? Less headache, but of course you lose control, right? Because you're not in control of these low level things. In fact, you don't have to be. You don't have to be in control of all these things. So that is public cloud, such as Azure. Hybrid cloud is basically when you imagine a bank. Imagine a bank, right? Bank is dealing with a lot of private data, customer sensitive data. Or imagine somebody like a government entity, right? Like Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Home Affairs, etc. As much as they want to adopt public cloud and shut down their data centers, there would always be some uh, some data sensitivity issues or data residency issues, right? Or basically some governance requirement that would mandate these security related agencies in our respective countries to keep the data, because it is highly sensitive data, within their own control in their own data center. On one hand, there might be other applications where the classification of the data is not so sensitive, right? It's not so sensitive. If it is not so sensitive, they are okay to move that to cloud, to Azure. But what does hybrid mean is that for a bank, if they have some sensitive data that they still want to keep due to the compliance reasons, due to the regulatory requirements, they can keep it in on-prem. So hybrid basically means that you put something, you keep a few things on private cloud, and you move other things on the public cloud. So it's basically a combination of both. Now you can choose, all right, application number one, application number two, I would like to continue to run here in my private cloud, which would be basically similar to how Bella was running her business, right? On the other side, all other applications which are not holding, let's say, so much of personal data or sensitive data or whatever, those applications can move to the cloud. So that actually gets moved to something like Azure. But then when you do that, of course, there is a requirement that that these two should be able to talk to each other. But we will talk about that later when we go to the services. Okay. Now that is hybrid cloud. Private, public, hybrid. Understand one more thing when it comes to private cloud. One more thing. We talked about Bella's example, right? Bella Shop is an example of private cloud. On the other hand, what might happen is that Bella might say that, hey, I don't want to manage these data centers myself. Although I'm sure that I want to keep it, within my town itself, but I don't want to manage this myself, right? She can actually she can actually uh, give this responsibility to a third party as well, to a third party provider as well, which are basically maintaining the data center on their behalf, on her behalf. And that could be another example. Now let's say I basically give this responsibility to a IT services provider, to a IT services provider, and that provider is now responsible to manage this data center where Bella's website is running. Okay, so Bella is not maintaining that herself, but she has actually given this responsibility to a third party that is managing that data center for her. But it is still privately held, right? It is still private cloud. Okay, so keep that keep that in mind. So with that, I hope that brings some clarity over what public, private, and hybrid cloud means. Now you think of it in this manner: if if Bella's website was hosted in the private cloud, right, and her data, her invoices, her images, product images, everything was stored here in the private cloud. And she needed to access that. Now she is here. She needed to access that, right? She can get it locally, correct? Because everything is in the room. everything is in the room. She can very quickly basically access it and make use of that. But when it comes to the public cloud, how do we access? We access it over internet because these services are available on demand to you. But in order to use those services, in order to connect to those services, you need internet, right? So that internet connectivity has to be there. As long as it is there, you can go there, you can connect to the resources, you can connect to the website, you can get your data or whatever. You can do that. Okay. So keep that in mind as well. Hybrid model basically gives you flexibility also. Keep that in mind also. For customers like banks, right? Or the government organizations, for example. So for them, it is very much required, or it is a mandate that they want flexibility to choose what runs on premises and what runs in the public cloud. So hybrid actually gives them a lot of that flexibility. Okay. If I were to ask you which would be the most easiest from the maintenance perspective, it would be public cloud because Azure is doing that for you. They are maintaining it for you. If I were to ask you from the control perspective, which one has more control? Definitely, private cloud has more control, gives you absolute control over how you want to run. In case of Azure, you can't actually argue with Microsoft, hey, tell me how are you running your data centers, right? And I want to intervene. No, you can't do that. Okay. So these are three types of cloud providers. Okay, now we will talk about another thing where we will get into talking about infrastructure as service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Okay. Now, what are these three terms and what is the best way that you should be looking to understand them? Let's take an example, okay? We start from the very basic in this case. We go back to Bella's shop, right? What she did is that she basically provisioned, these racks in her shop, right? This piece of hardware. So these were basically, these big racks. There was storage available as well to store the data, and they were basically, the networking devices to connect everything. And then out of that, there were there were basically machines created, right? Using virtualization. Don't have to worry about what virtualization is. But these are not physical servers. If she needed 10 servers, not that she would require 10 CPU as we buy normally, right? For our house. No, it is not needed. You can actually have a one big server, and then you can do virtualization on top of that by using Hyper-V or VMware type of softwares. And then you can actually take up take some amount of that compute and you can create its own virtual machine. What is virtual machine? Same like your laptop, as you're running your laptop, right? My laptop has an operating system, Windows or Linux, right? That laptop also has some compute like CPU. It has memory. It has some storage attached to that, right? It has all of that. So when I say machine or a virtual machine, it is similar to how your laptop works. Okay, one individual machine is that. Now, the VMs, these virtual machines, are are then crafted out of that big rack that we have in Bella's shop, is how it is done. Now, infrastructure as a service. Now, since she has decided to move everything to the cloud, what happens here is that for her, there are three ways in which she can think about moving all whatever she was running in on premises to cloud. And what was she running? She was running a website, right? So she was basically running a website. Now, what she can do is when we talk about infrastructure as a service to begin with, right? Infrastructure as a service. What happens is that Azure would tell Bella that, all right, this virtual machine that you are running, this virtual machine, right? Let me just expand that here. This machine that you are running, one machine, this machine can be moved over to the cloud as is. You can move it as is. Okay. So it is still like a machine on the cloud, right? And if you open up this machine, you know what happens is basically what are the building blocks of this machine? If you were to ask me, see the building blocks of this machines are we basically require storage. Okay, or maybe to make it easy, let's do it this way. So I don't really have to write so much. I'm going to just take basically uh, yeah basically snapshot of this image and I'll put it here. Okay, so yeah, this is better. So now you see, when it comes to running the same machine in cloud, then what happens is that there are few things that are building blocks of that machine. For example, if you start looking at it from here, right? Storage. Any machine, any laptop that you are running anywhere, right? That actually requires some storage because everything gets stored in there. It requires networking component, right? So you can connect with perhaps another laptop to internet that is required. Compute, which is CPU, memory, all that is required also, right? And once we have these three components available, these three basic components available, then on top of that, we basically create something like a laptop or something like a virtual machine. Now think of virtual machine like your like your virtual laptop, right? That we are virtualizing everything. Now, when we are virtualizing everything, then where does this physical infrastructure go? It actually goes to Azure, as you can see in infrastructure as a service. So compute, networking, and storage is provided by Azure. You don't see that. You don't buy that. You don't acquire that at all, right? So then all Bella has to do if she wanted to bring her website and running it in cloud was, and the easiest way was for her to go with infrastructure as a service, in which the entire machine comes up here and it runs as is. The only difference is that storage, networking, and compute is taken care of by Azure. So she doesn't have to buy any hardware. You look at it that way. She doesn't have to buy. Perhaps just go to a portal, create a virtual machine by few clicks, machine is available, bring her website, and have it running there. Is all that she has to do. And this is called infrastructure as a service. In this case, what Azure is providing you is merely infrastructure. So you can bring in your own machines that you were running in on premises and you can run them as it is in cloud. So what have you changed? You have changed in a way that you're not having to maintain any hardware now, correct? So in infrastructure as service, only infrastructure is provided by the cloud provider. Then on top of it, the virtual machine you will manage. Operating system, which is Windows, Linux, you manage. So you can see green is you manage and cloud provider is blue, right? And then runtime, applications, data access, all that you manage. Now, in your laptop, what do you have typically? You have an operating system. In that, you might have basically a runtime. You might have applications, right? Many applications like Zoom, right, or this Whiteboard or Office or whatever. And those applications might have their own data, right? So all that is managed by you. So once you start the VM or once you log into the laptop, you have all that. Azure cannot go inside and see what is happening inside that virtual machine. They cannot see because it is infrastructure as a service. Okay. So that is what it is. Only hardware is provided by Azure, everything else you manage. You have full control over that, right? Look at it this way. Only you know the credential to log into the machine. Even Azure doesn't know that. So you have full control over there. Now, if you were to compare this IaaS to on-premises thing now, you realize that on-premises Bella was having to do everything, right? Bella was having to do everything. And see, if you have any questions, I'm actively looking at the chat. So if you have any questions, post the questions in the chat and I'll pick it up now or after some time. Okay. All right. So that is infrastructure as a service. That is the first step for Bella, and which is the easiest for her. At least now she doesn't have to maintain the data center. She's happy with maintaining the machine. Perhaps she can buy she can get an Azure administrator, and that person would actually take care of maintaining all the administrative stuff of that, of that website. So mainly infrastructure as a service. What happens when you move from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service is that rather than infrastructure, rather than only infrastructure, Azure is now providing you the platform as a service. Now, you would wonder what is a platform? Okay, to understand that, let's do it this way. If you are new in IT, a very common architectural pattern that you would have to understand is called, this three-tier architecture. Is this three-tier architecture? So three-tier application, what they are, how do they work, right? A three-tier application in IT means that we are talking about Bella's website, right? It would have three tier when it comes to architecting that. Tier number one would be basically the web tier. Tier number two would be the app tier. And tier number three would be the database tier. If it is new to you, not to worry. Website, which is the front end, purely the front end, is to be hosted, right? That front end, website front end, would get hosted on the web layer in three-tier architecture, right? So this is one tier, this is two tier, and this is three tier. Application logic. Let's say Bella is offering some discounts, right? Based on if you're purchasing 5 items, then she would give you one free. So then that logic that okay, whether somebody's purchasing 5 items, then automatically basically adding up another item or adjusting the cost of the sixth item because that has to be free. All that is business logic. Application layer keeps basically that business logic. Okay. And then database layer, order is placed. Where does the order get stored? In the database. Somewhere there is a database. And if you have heard about, things like SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL, all these are databases. Okay. So all that data that is getting stored is your database layer. Okay. Now imagine if I were to do IaaS, how will I architecture this into the three-tiered architecture, that website of Bella into the three-tier architecture. What I would do is I would do it in this manner. All right, one machine and another machine. So another virtual machine, right? And third virtual machine. So I have one web server, I have another app server, and I have third database server. Three virtual machines. And since it is virtual machine, Azure is only providing you what? Azure is only providing you compute, networking, and storage. Everything else you are managing. Everything else you are managing. These three virtual machines you are responsible to manage, right? As long as it is infrastructure as a service. Now, platform as a service. What this does is that, what if I wanted to reduce my responsibilities to manage virtual machine, operating system, and runtime? I don't want to manage that. I want Azure to manage that for me because I'm just starting with three virtual machines right now. I might have one Azure administrator, and that person can take care of all the three machines. Tomorrow, as more and more user requests are coming up, I might need to have more web servers added to scale it, more application servers, right? And perhaps more database servers. More and more responsibilities would come up. You want to minimize that. And when you want to minimize your responsibilities, your administrative responsibilities to maintain this infrastructure, you choose platform as a service offering. With platform as a service offering, what happens is Bella can choose to run the same website, but now she also doesn't have to manage a virtual machine, as you can see here. Virtual machine, Azure is managing. Operating system, Azure is managing. Runtime, Azure is managing. So there is no virtual machine to be seen in that case. What what could happen is that now Azure might say, okay, fine. This side you have IaaS implementation. On the other side, if it becomes PaaS, how you can do it is that all the web, all the web, all the website code, let's say front end code, and the app layer code, right? You basically package it into one service. You package it into one service, and we will get to the service. On the other side, the database that you are running, let's say SQL, you package it into another service. You choose another service for that, service 2 and service 1. Now, Azure would provide you these services, service 1, service 2, service 50, service 200. There are hundreds of such services. But when we say PaaS, you need to realize that what we are saying is, I want to get away from managing virtual machines myself because every virtual machines I need to manage them. Can you give me a service if I have to run my database, let's say SQL Server or Oracle? Give me a service where I am only interested in the database and the data that it stores. I'm not interested in the virtual machines on which it is running, operating system on which it is running. I don't want to manage that. And that is exactly what PaaS is. What Azure would do is they would provide you a PaaS service. Let's say for the database, they would provide you a PaaS service. Now, rather than installing that database in a virtual machine, right, you are simply creating an instance of that service. And you don't see any virtual machine behind the scene. There is no virtual machine that you're responsible to manage. Azure would manage it for you. And that's why it is called that you don't manage runtime, you don't manage operating system, and you also don't manage virtual machine. And that is actually PaaS. Okay, that is PaaS. So for clarity, as you move from IaaS to PaaS, your responsibilities reduce. Cloud providers' responsibilities increase. Okay, and any day, if I want to go to cloud, I want to reduce my responsibility, right? Bella would want to reduce that responsibility. She would not want to have more and more Azure administrators or system administrators managing that. Keep it simple. That's why platform as a service. So platform, like a database, is offered as a service, okay, in which you can host a database. On the other side, a service is provided to you where you can bring in your website, your front end, and your application logic and host it there. Again, a PaaS service. So you just needed two PaaS services, and your architecture got much more simpler. Now there were no virtual machines to be managed. It was made simple with the help of PaaS. Okay, that is platform as a service. And now software as a service is actually the third thing here. If you have if you have heard about Office 365, if you have heard about OneDrive, right? All these are examples of software as a service. Now, those old days, we had to install everything on our machine. If I had a laptop, I would install Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., right? Today we don't have to. I mean, it's all online. I can just open it in a browser and I can work on Microsoft Word, Excel. Well, for my convenience, if I still want to install thick client on my laptop, I can do that. I can do that. That's fine. But that is example of software as a service, where you are only responsible to manage data and access. Now look at MS Office. You create Word document. You only care about Word document. You don't care about how is Word installed, how is it configured, how is Excel working. You don't have to worry about that. What you care is your data and who can access that data, who can access that Word document, or who can access that Excel file, right? That is software as a service. Now, you look at it this way. You are moving in from on-premises to cloud. You have certain options. Okay, yeah, SharePoint as well, correct. SharePoint Online, for example. So SharePoint Online is another example. We used to install SharePoint on many, many machines. In the backend, there used to be SQL Server, a lot of instances of SQL Server databases. It would result into a lot more virtual machines. But now it is made simple. It is offered as a SaaS product. Azure manages everything, everything. You just basically create an instance of that for you, for yourself. Okay, that is software as a service. Now, coming back to my point and to conclude this, when any business is migrating from on-premises to cloud, they have these three options: infrastructure as services, right, which is the most easiest, if you see, most easiest, right? Because bring in the same, exactly the same virtual machines, run them here as is, right? Very easy. But you might not get the full advantage of the cloud because you're still having to maintain those virtual machines. The better option is platform as a service. Okay, so you get rid of all the virtual machines, right? That is a better option. So always look for PaaS over IaaS, and then SaaS. Not everything can be packaged as SaaS. So the PaaS is the sweet spot. SaaS, only a few services would be there, right? Like Salesforce is a SaaS service, right? Some services, let's say you are running a very old, very old traditional application for which there is no PaaS service available in Azure because it's pretty old and Microsoft doesn't care creating one PaaS service for that, right? Because it is not a good use of the investment. In that case, continue to run it on IaaS in a virtual machine. Continue to do that. But whatever can be migrated to PaaS, do that. So that is infrastructure as service, platform as service, and software as service. And as you move from left to right, your responsibilities go down, cloud providers' responsibilities increase. Okay. Now Bella is very happy that she's looking to basically perhaps take a mix of IaaS and PaaS when it comes to migrating the website, etc., or any other solution that she was running. And now she has completely gotten rid of this on-premises setup where she had to manage everything. Okay, so she's very happy. She's very happy with that. Any questions at this point? Any questions? Okay, so you guys are not asking many questions, which is in a way good, but I think would be even better if you have some. If not, it's okay. You can perhaps post it later as well. Okay. Now, okay, there is another thing which I want to cover in this session, and let me just go ahead to do that. And maybe, let me just come back to show you what have we covered so far from here. So we covered the case study, right? We covered Bella's boutique case study here, and then of course we we basically talked about cloud computing, its benefits. We talked about key terms such as economies of scale, pay as you go, CAPEX versus OPEX, right? We talked about all of that. We talked about cloud models, public, private, and hybrid. And we talked about IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. One last thing which I want to talk about in this section, in this part, is Azure core architectural component. And it is a very important thing. Okay. So let's dive into that last topic for today. And in the meantime, if you have any questions. Okay, so there is a question from Vasanthi Krishnan, eager to know about how runtime plays a role in the cloud. Now, see, runtime could be if my application is an ASP.NET application, for example, right? Then .NET framework is required, and that .NET is a runtime in this case. Okay, .NET is a runtime. Now, if I wanted to run this website, let's say Bella's website, it is built using .NET. Okay, now if it is built using .NET, and if I choose IaaS, I will have to install that runtime myself. I will have to install that .NET framework. On top of that only, my application can be deployed. And if it were to be a Java-based application, then of course, Java would have to be installed, and that is the runtime. Okay. Now, when Bella chooses platform as a service, then IaaS, then she doesn't have to worry about installing runtime. She doesn't have to install .NET or Java runtime environment. No, it would be managed by Azure. All you need to do is to tell Azure, right? Azure would like to know, hey Bella, you're bringing in your website. Tell us, is it a .NET based website or is it a Java based website? You tell that, it will automatically behind the scene create a VM, install everything, and keep it ready. You don't see the VM. Okay, by the way, you don't see the VM. So that's how it would work. Now, which service do big companies like banks choose? So see, we have not spoken about services yet. We will talk about a lot of them, but just to answer virtual machines, we talked about virtual machine. That is one compute service is used by almost every organization, be it bank, government, they use that, right? On the other side, when it comes to PaaS services, right, we have services like, I mean, I can name the service, but it wouldn't make any sense to you at this moment. Okay. So I can say, things like there is basically this Azure App Service. It's a PaaS service. It lets you deploy your websites without you having to maintain operating system. Okay. For SQL, I can tell you that there is a service called as Azure SQL, which is a PaaS service, which lets you run SQL Server database without having to worry about virtual machine installing SQL. No. Okay. So that is that. Okay. Okay. Somebody says three-tier architecture part was a little difficult to understand. No problem. We have to break it up. Okay. We'll go step by step. You don't have to basically take everything and understand everything in one go. Revisit the recording, revisit the video, but just keep it simple that any application we need to design, there is a front end, the website that you see when it loads. Okay, that is the front end. It has to be hosted somewhere in a web server. Okay, like Tomcat, IIS. That is that layer. That is web. Application layer is more business logic, where business logics are done. For example, to calculate discount, if the product ordered are more than five, then there is 50% discount on the sixth one. This is business logic. It is separate from your front end. Front end is merely displaying. This is application logic, which is business logic, which is your middle tier. And finally, where does the data get stored? In the database. In the database, that is your database tier or the third tier. So we call it three-tiered application. Okay. All right. Now, one last thing to cover, which is Azure architectural components, right? Now, what happens is that you need to understand how is Azure structured. Okay, how is Azure structured? And again, to make it easy for me, so I don't really have to do a lot of whiteboarding here, what I want to do is I actually want to bring this thing here on the whiteboard, and it will become so much easier for me to explain to you. Yeah, just give me one moment. Okay. Yeah, so architectural component, we will get to that. In the meantime, take a look at this image that I pasted on the that I pasted over here. Okay, right. That is good. Yeah, that's good. All right. So, see, now what happens is that although cloud is providing you the benefits, right, such as high availability, scalability, right, security, and all that, how it is doing that, it is important to understand that. So, very quickly, take a look at this. We call it that it is global. This service is global, right? So, how Azure works is that Bella was located somewhere in India, right? The data that she's managing is not so sensitive, but perhaps she has, some personally identifiable data or PII. She has to take care of that. Perhaps the government in India would say that any data belonging to the Indian citizen cannot go out of India, right? To address that requirement, if Azure has to really work in India to respect that regulation, that policy, Azure must ensure that they have a data center firstly in India where they can keep all this data because they are not allowed to take all this data outside. In other words, it means that you are basically making it possible for the people in India or elsewhere to deploy their applications, to bring in their applications, same like Bella. But you're telling them that since I have a data center in India, I'm not taking your data anywhere outside. It will remain in India. For that, they have to have data center, right? Many other countries would be having similar kind of regulation. You go to banking industry, you go to defense or government sector, the requirements would become even more stringent. To respect that, what Azure has done is that looking at it globally, right from the top, there is this notion of geographies at the top. So the entire Azure infrastructure, it is basically divided into what is called as geographies first. Okay. So Azure has geographies to honor data residency and compliance requirement. Exactly what I spoke about just now. Okay. Within geography, then they're divided into four. One is Americas, another one is Europe, Asia Pacific, and Middle East and Africa. So they divided that into these four geographies, because Europe would have their own basically regulatory requirements or compliance requirements, and they will be different from how it is in America. That will be different from how it is in Asia Pacific, etc., etc. So therefore, divided into four different geographies. So geographies, how many geographies are there? Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, and Middle East and Africa. Four geographies. Okay. Then, if I were to double click on Asia Pacific, so when you double click on geographies, what happens is then comes region. So the first thing that we learned is geography, right? Second thing we are learning is region. And region is always within a geography, as you can see, right? Is always in a geography. Every geography has a number of regions. And just to take an example, in Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia is one region, which is pretty much here in Singapore, right? Within Asia Pacific, there are multiple other regions which are in India. Okay. There are many other regions which are available even Australia. All those are Asia Pacific regions. And I'm just taking examples of two, Southeast Asia and East Asia. Southeast Asia is basically Singapore, and East Asia is Hong Kong. Okay. So they are defined as region. Now, what happens is within region, then, and I'll come to this region pairing, whenever you deploy something, let's say today I decided to start my own business and I needed some compute, right? I choose Southeast Asia region, I go to Azure portal, I choose Southeast Asia and I deploy that. What happens is Azure automatically takes a backup of that here from Singapore, and it actually replicates that backup to East Asia automatically. So every region has a paired region to make sure that there is high availability. Your data gets replicated automatically, okay, which is to increase high availability. If you don't do that, there is something wrong. Let's say the entire Singapore is down for some reason, my data would be gone, my application would be gone. To prevent that, they do that. Okay. Now, if you were to double click on Southeast Asia, then what happens is every region has a number of data centers. Every region has a number of data centers. As you can see in Southeast Asia, I'm depicting 6 data centers. Data center number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So geographies have regions, regions have data centers, and in the data center is how you basically deploy your resources, whatever you are creating, perhaps a virtual machine or whatever, okay, is how it works. So just keep these couple of things in mind as well for this session. Of course, we will double click on this in the next video because this is very fundamental to understand how does high availability work, how does fault tolerance work, etc., etc. We will understand that using the same graphic in the next session. But for now, I will leave you with geography, region, and then within that, there are a number of data centers, is how these architectural components are structured. And, maybe we have run a little bit over time, as I see, but that's fine. Whatever we have covered, perhaps take some time to go through the recorded session, consume that, digest that, before we get to the next session. And that's why I'm keeping, that gap in between. So do that. Any questions if you had? Uh, Maybe once this live broadcast is available, just put it in the comment window and I'll actively monitor that. Okay. Uh, yeah, put it there and I will make sure that I go to every single question and I answer that. And but it has to be related to what we have covered. Okay. And with that, I would say that we have come to the end of this session, and I hope you enjoyed that. Share with me the feedback. How was it in terms of logistics, audio, video, in terms of the speed, whether slow, fast, whether do I need to make any changes? Any of that suggestion that'll help make the next section better. Share that. Okay. And I appreciate you taking time to join this session and joining me live. This was my first live, so happy that we have successfully done that. And thanks for your support. And I'll see you in the next session. Okay. Enjoy your dinner and see you again in the next session. Thank you.